Hello, thank you for joining us today and welcome to ESHA Research's webinar on using recipe yields and moisture adjustments. My name is Ben, joined as always by Alicia. We're going to go through that topic today. As always, we'll go through a little bit of background. ESHA was established in 1981, released our first software in 1984. The software we're going to look at today is the Genesis software. We can get our slides moving around. There we go. We have a number of solutions: Genesis R&D Food, Genesis R&D Supplements, Food Processor, Consulting Services. As I said, we're going to be using Genesis R&D Food today. There she goes. Which was released in 1991, and it helps users manage processes, overcome industry challenges, meet federal requirements, and does things like product development, formula analysis, menu analysis, reporting, and regulatory compliance. We do have 2 webinars upcoming that are on our calendar right now. On July 17th, we're going to be doing a 2016 nutrition labeling guideline review. So for the new labeling laws, we're just going to do a review of all of the discussion that has gone on, changes, all that sort of stuff, fiber, added sugars. So just a kind of an overview on all of the new guidelines. And then on July 31st, we're going to be looking at working with proprietary blends in Genesis Supplements. So Genesis Supplements is a separate software than what we're going to be looking at today. If you do dietary supplements, it is a great application, and I would advise you to reach out to our sales team to talk to you about that. Who is that?
And then go to staff.
There we go. Sorry about that, everybody. I think somebody was unmuted when they shouldn't have been. But we're going to be looking at proprietary blends for the supplements application. Like I said, if you have any questions about that program, reach out to us. We can answer those questions for you. Please note, as always, this webinar is being recorded. So if you did miss out on it, you can always go to our website and view that at a later time or share it with any of your colleagues. As well as our past webinars. So if there's any in the past you wanted to look at, or if you want to register for those future ones. If you have any questions along the way, let us know. You have that control panel for GoToWebinar that has a Q&A piece. Ask those questions along the way, and then either myself or one of our other colleagues will be answering those along the way. What we're going to look at today, our agenda: types of foods that warrant adjustments, how to determine the amount of adjustment, how to enter that into Genesis, and we'll answer some questions both along the way and at the very end publicly. If we don't get to your question, we'll generally get to those individually after the fact, or if it's just something that's kind of more specific. And we may not answer all of those out loud because maybe it's an individual type of question, something like that. So keep those questions coming. And again, reach out to our support team, our nutrition team, after the fact too, and get into some more in-depth discussions as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Alicia, and she's going to walk us through that topic today.
Thank you, Ben. Yes, with this webinar, we're focusing primarily on the use of Genesis to account for moisture loss in your products. Why do we even do that? Well, think about what you're making and how it's made. So much more goes into your formulas than just your ingredients. The final content is not necessarily just the sum of the ingredients that you include in your recipe. Often processing by cooking, drying, and many other treatments can affect the nutritional values that you'll report on your labels. And there are several tools in Genesis that can help you fine-tune your analyses. The moisture adjustment option is probably one of the most commonly used adjustments in Genesis, and that's the one we're going to focus on today. What types of foods warrant a moisture adjustment? Some examples, and this are just a few examples, include baked goods, candies, think of caramel that are cooked down and reduced, products that encounter boiling and reduction like syrups, sauces, soups, and other liquids. products that encounter a drying process, like your dried or freeze-dried foods, anything that's exposed to dry heat like smoked meats or smoked foods, again, where that moisture is being lost during that processing. Many foods experience some kind of moisture loss, some certainly more than others. So consider with your products, is there a measurable or significant amount of change from your beginning ingredients to the finished product, and what can you do to account for that? Here's an example of bread. When we start with a portion of dough, as the dough is baked, we lose moisture, and the portion of the dough weighs less due to the moisture loss, but we still have the carbs and protein and fat that contribute to the weight of the food, and those components also contribute nutritionally. So what does that look like on a label? In Genesis, because we often determine the serving size right away and commonly set a specific weight for the serving size, a label for one serving of our recipe before we apply a moisture adjustment might look like the label here on the left. So that's as is, recipe, no adjustments, and that would represent the dough in this example. Once we apply the moisture adjustment, notice that the serving size on the label on the right is the same, because in this example we set the serving size at a determined weight, but the nutrient content shifts. So it's common to see an increase in nutrients. It gets condensed, and you can see here calories and carbohydrates have increased noticeably, which makes sense for a product like bread. When we remove some of the moisture content, we typically do see that concentration or the increase in nutrients reported, and the level of that change in the nutrient amounts depends on the amount of moisture adjustment as well as rounding applied on the label. So you can see some of the nutrients show a noticeable difference, like the calories here, where others like fiber may experience such a slight change that the rounded label value doesn't change the underlying unrounded value. However, you may notice changes to that if you look on something like the spreadsheet or the multi-column report. But just know in Genesis, it is common to see the label nutrients change after you apply that moisture loss. And then when we set the serving size in Genesis, I want to remind you that you can do so in a few different ways, and that could have an effect on how Genesis behaves when you apply the moisture loss. With the recipe, you can indicate that the recipe or the batch makes so many servings, or you can indicate that the serving size weighs a specific amount. In this example, it's set to 250 grams. So if you indicate the recipe makes so many servings, when you apply a moisture loss, Genesis will decrease the overall batch weight as well as the weight of each serving as it removes moisture. It's taking the total batch weight minus the moisture loss and then dividing the difference by the number of servings that you indicated when you said a recipe makes so many servings. If you set the serving size to a specific weight, however, when you apply a moisture loss, Genesis adjusts your ingredients per serving so that the serving weight is met from the components available. So keep in mind that the components or the proximates that make up the weight of the food are fat, carbohydrates, protein, alcohol, ash, and moisture. And when you remove moisture, the other components have to fill in to make up the weight. So how do you determine the amount of the moisture loss? That depends on the type of products that you're working with, and if the moisture loss is the only thing occurring to affect the weight difference in the food. You could take before and after measurements of portions or the full batch, and whichever is feasible. Depends on, the physical availability of your products and what you can test on and the information that you can get from the kitchen. And if the moisture adjustment alone would give you a reasonable representation of your product, then again, go ahead and apply that moisture loss. Another option, of course, is to send the finished product to a lab to obtain a moisture content value, and that would give you a target value that you could work with in Genesis. Just keep in mind if multiple factors like moisture loss and fat loss are causing a change in the weight before and after preparation, then you have more to consider and you have to account for those differences the best you can. If you could determine differences by measurements, then that might be a workable method. But if a lab analysis of moisture and fat, for instance, might give you the pieces of data you need to make the most accurate adjustments, then consider what works best for you and what works best for that particular product. In Genesis, when you have your recipe open, the yield adjustments are available through the Edit Yields button, and you'll see this yield adjustments window as shown here. You'll notice that there is more available than just moisture loss. We have fat adjustments. So if your food loses an amount of fat only, or if you have a target fat content that you're working with, you could use the fat adjustment to set that accordingly. Processing loss can also be entered here. Processing loss refers to amount of the full finished product that might be lost at preparation surfaces or on production lines. And the processing loss removes a portion of the entire batch rather than just one component like moisture or fat. And you can see with the moisture loss that we can enter loss in terms of weight or by percent. There's a drop-down menu in the features under units, and you can choose by percent or various units of weight. And just note in Genesis, a moisture loss entered by percent means what percent of the moisture content was lost. Genesis gives you an original value and a percent of moisture as reference information, so you have those starting points to help you figure out that information. Also note here that the moisture information is coming from your ingredient data. So for each ingredient, you must populate the nutrient field called water so that the moisture content is reported appropriately. You can't remove moisture from the recipe if the moisture isn't reported for the ingredients. If you do try to enter a moisture adjustment that is greater, or a moisture loss that is greater than the moisture content that you're reporting, the software does alert you, and you'll know that there's an issue. So if you see an alert like that, you just need to go back to your ingredients and check to see that the water nutrient field is populated for each ingredient. And you may notice that Genesis and supplier data sheets use the terms water and moisture interchangeably. So with the nutrient field in Genesis, we call that water, and the yield adjustment features field here, it's referred to as moisture. We mean moisture content rather than water as an individual added ingredient. You can apply moisture loss to your recipe even if you don't have water as an ingredient in your recipe. There are ingredients that absorb or gain moisture as they're prepared. So think about pasta, rice, beans. These all swell as you cook them, and you may end up with a greater weight than with what you started. The moisture adjustment feature is not designed to account for absorption or a gain in moisture. Typically in Genesis, these would be handled by either selecting a cooked form of the food from the database or obtaining cooked information from your supplier, if they can provide that, and entering that cooked form as an ingredient in your software, or taking measurements to determine how much absorption has occurred. If water is the only ingredient absorbed, then we would just add the appropriate amount of water as an ingredient in our recipe. However, if ingredients like juice or brine are absorbed, you need to consider nutrients that might increase, like sodium or sugar or other nutrients. Or if you drain an ingredient like pasta and some of the starches are drained off as well, you may need to determine if this has an effect on your ending nutritional content. You just want to take the appropriate measurements or analysis steps that you would need to account for those. And of course, with any adjustments that you make in Genesis, you want to maintain a record of the supporting documentation. You can make notes directly within the recipe using the notes field, or you could use the audit trail, or you might attach documents in the recipe record directly. And we've covered some of those functions in previous webinars. So there are some general ideas about why and how we'd use the moisture adjustment, and now I'll jump into Genesis and show you some of these in action. So in Genesis, I can just open a recipe. And here I have a tomato soup. So we'll use that as an example today. I want to show you a few things just in Genesis that I've already talked about so you can see where those are located. So I have set my serving size as 250 grams. So I'm using that first example, a specific weight, and my serving of tomato soup weighs 250 grams. Remember, I talked about a recipe makes so many servings, or a serving weighs a specific weight, and I'm using the second option there. And then I want to talk about water a little bit. So I've just got my mandatory 2016 set of nutrients displayed here. It doesn't include water, but I want to look at that and make sure I'm reporting that for my recipe. So to do so, I'm going to cancel out of here. Again, we've talked about nutrients to view in the past, but it's always good to review this. The nutrients to view are sets of nutrients. Some are presets that come with the software, and you can also create your own by modify and edit here. But I've created a set that is my 2016 mandatory nutrients as well as water. And so I can just show you again, going back to my edit recipe and nutrients screen, you can see that water is displayed here. So that's just kind of, I've selected water in my set of nutrients, but now I do need to do a little further review. So from here, I'm going to view my spreadsheet report. And again, the spreadsheet just gives us a closer look at the detail of the nutrient information for all the ingredients that are included in my recipe. We've talked about this again before, but if you see red dashes on your spreadsheet, you likely want to fill in those blanks, especially for mandatory nutrients that you'll be reporting on the label. Here I have a few dashes, so ideally I would want to go back and fill those in. But today we're focusing on water. We can see here that all of the ingredients in my recipe are reporting water. So I'm in good shape there. And then I also want to show you my label so we can see what the label looks like prior to applying the moisture adjustment. And here I'm just going to show a standard nutrition facts panel for my serving of tomato soup. And it's coming along. So standard label, set my serving size. I've done a little editing here just to show you a more compliant type looking label. But you can see, especially in bold, 100 calories per serving of my soup before I've made any adjustment to it. So what I want to do is apply a moisture loss to represent that cooking process. I've combined all of my ingredients, and then I'm going to cook it further and remove some of that moisture. So to access the moisture adjustment, go to Edit Yields. And again, we see that yield adjustments screen. Like I mentioned, it has those various sections, like the moisture adjustment section. You could adjust for fat or processing if you wanted to. Here with the moisture section, I'm going to work first in weight, a loss based in terms of weight. So what I've done is measured my batch. I've got my batch weight up here, the total weight of all my ingredients. I've cooked my soup, and I have my pre-cooking weight, and I identified that in the cooking of this soup, I lost 1,135 grams. And again, these units you can select from much larger units. So if it's in pounds, ounces, anything there, select what you know and use that. So watch what happens when I apply my moisture loss, As I mentioned, the label nutrients may increase. That's the typical pattern that we would see here. So calories, again, is most noticeable. And then sodium, I often look at sodium because a little change can make a big difference on the label. But you notice most of these nutrients increased by applying that moisture loss. And again, that's what they set serving weight. Let me remove that. We'll just apply it by percent. So again, I'm just going to clear out that moisture loss so we're looking at the original label. And again here, percent is in terms of the moisture content. So if I have that 1,135 gram weight loss, that calculates to 29.8% of a moisture loss. So 29.8% of this original moisture content value is what I'm losing. Apply that. And again, essentially the same results that we see an increase in the nutrient content per serving. So again, just keep in mind the amount of moisture loss that is being applied, and if we are working with percents, speak in terms of the moisture content and not in terms of your overall batch weight necessarily, so percent of the moisture content that you're losing. I'll show you one more example with that recipes per serving, or recipe makes so many servings. And we'll take a look at how that might affect a label. So here we have another example recipe. It's also a soup. I'll view the label here. And this time I've set my recipe makes so many servings. So the recipe makes 12 servings. And that is the math that Genesis is going to use to come up with nutrient values on the label. So here you can see the nutrient values per serving. Right now the serving size is listing at 354 grams. Again, that's before applying my moisture loss. So I'm going to go through the same steps. Edit yields, apply a moisture loss. I'm going to work in weight again. And so applying this moisture loss, again with my recipes make so many servings, you may have noticed that the nutrient content values did not change, but my serving size decreased. So the Genesis is removing weight of moisture content and adjusting my serving weight to still come up with 12 servings per recipe. And then the nutrient values on the label stay the same. So I hope that gives you a bit more explanation and what to expect from Genesis when you're working with moisture loss. And again, we had some questions coming in about specific products, but not every type of food follows a simple moisture adjustment. There might be other things going on, other processes or losses, other factors like fat or portions of the food, the original recipe that are being lost. So you really have to consider what's happening to your food as you are preparing it. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Ben, and he'll tell you more about training and other items.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Alicia. That was a great overview. If anyone else is like me and feels like they need a little bit of additional training and knowledge, we do have some trainings coming up for Genesis. I mentioned in our last webinar, but I wanted to mention it again. We do have a new format for our training now. Instead of being in the past where it was you're either going to a 2-day professional or a 2-day advanced training, we've gone to now just a standard Genesis training. It's going to be 3 days now instead of 2. You can either do the first 2 days, which is the professional training. You can do just the 3rd day, which is the advanced training, or you can do all 3, and it encompasses all of the professional and advanced training from the past. And we do still have some of those specialized ones as well. June 19th and 20th coming up, our next training is a specific training. It's going to be for menu labeling, so it focuses more on the grocery or restaurant side of the regulations. And then coming up July 10th through 12th, you've got, again, that new format of Genesis training where you've got the professional and advanced. And then you've got one in August and October as well. So again, like I said, if you feel like me and you feel like you need a little bit more, especially on those regulatory questions and kind of those specific questions, feel free to look into that training and sign up and join us there. Before we get into some of those questions, as we always like to point out, we have those helpful resources, LinkedIn, our blog, e-newsletter, e-learning center with all of our past webinars and tutorials. All of that can be found either on our website or on those links that you see there. And if you have any questions after this, if you wanted to have maybe a more in-depth conversation with us, either from a support standpoint, questions on the specific topic, maybe some questions on your account, give us a call, shoot us an email. We're always here to help out and answer questions. Getting into our questions now. Question number 1, Alicia, what if I don't know the amount of my moisture loss?
Sure, so you just want to obtain that in some logical way. So if that does mean that you can take measurements, if it's type of food or product that you can measure moisture loss, and moisture loss is the only thing that's occurring, then that might be a good option for you. But if it's a more involved process and many more factors are playing into loss in weight or the adjustments that you need to make, then lab analysis might be the best way to go.
Great. Our next question, what if only part of my recipe or part of my finished product needs a moisture adjustment?
Sure. So a simple example of that might be a frosted cake. So we're going really simple here, but you might need to consider breaking your recipe into a few different pieces. So say you have a recipe for the cake and you have a recipe for the frosting. You may have to set up two separate recipes, one for the cake in which you apply a moisture adjustment, and then one for the frosting that's just a combination of ingredients, and then create a third recipe to combine those. So what you end up is that third recipe has subcomponent recipes or recipes within recipes. So just kind of come up with that plan on how to approach which portion of it needs the moisture loss and how to account for that.
Perfect. Next question. I just realized that most of my recipes should have a moisture adjustment applied. How do I go about fixing this?
Welcome to realization. So now that you know, knowledge is power, right? So think about the products and how you can best determine the moisture information for what you need. Also, as I mentioned, review your ingredients. So you do want to start with looking at your nutrients, or your ingredients, and filling in that water nutrient field. So you want to report moisture, water for all your ingredients first, and then determine how you can identify the moisture loss that's occurring and make that moisture adjustment in Genesis.
Great. It looks like we have time for maybe just one more question. Even if I enter a moisture loss, the sodium and protein levels never change with or without a moisture adjustment. Why might this be?
Oh, sure. So a few things that you might want to consider and check out in Genesis. A few things could be going on. Check to see how you determine the serving size. So just like I demonstrated, are you using the recipe makes so many servings, or did you set a specific serving weight for your serving? So that's one thing you could check out. Another is consider the amount of moisture loss that you are applying. So if it's not a great amount, if it's not a great adjustment, it may or may not be making a difference on your label nutrients, especially if rounding is coming into play. And then again, if you are using percent versus the weight, if you're applying a moisture adjustment by percent, are you entering that in terms of the overall weight of the batch, or are you entering the percent based on the moisture content? Those numbers can be very different depending on what type of food it is, if it's one that has a lot of moisture content. So give those a think and see if any of those might apply and make adjustments accordingly.
All right, I think we got maybe one or two more. Here's another question. In order for moisture adjustment to work properly, in addition to water, would you be required to have an ash value for your ingredients or your recipe?
In Genesis, no, it's not relying on all of the components necessarily to do the math. What you want to consider is your data checks. So if you get a spec sheet that's reporting everything but ash, do the numbers add up? Just do that visual check or use the check data feature in Genesis to take a closer look at your numbers. But if your supplier is providing with moisture information, that is one piece that's required for the moisture adjustment, the ash not so much. But again, just check your data, make sure it all adds up.
All right, and one last question. I think we kind of covered it during the webinar, but just to kind of reiterate the question, and I'll maybe kind of paraphrase what the question exactly was, but if I have an ingredient that contains 10 or 15% moisture in that specific ingredient, and then I also add just added water to my recipe, is Genesis factoring in just the added water, or will the moisture adjustment also factor the moisture that's in that ingredient as well?
Right, so yes, Genesis is looking at the total moisture content. So whether that water field, the water nutrient field, is reported for an ingredient that is not water, or the water ingredient itself. Genesis is looking at all of that moisture content data, or all of the values that are being reported in the water nutrient field that is an indication of moisture. So you don't, that's when I said you don't have to have water as an ingredient in your recipe to make a moisture adjustment. Genesis looks at all the moisture content.
You just got to make sure there's a moisture value for all those ingredients. That's the huge piece. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I know there were a lot of questions. We didn't get to everybody's question. I think some of them were kind of specific. We're also running out of time a little bit here, so we will follow up with you. And if you want to reach back out to either support@esha.com, or if it was more of an account type question, sales@esha.com, reach out to us, ask some questions, and we can help you on an individual basis. Again, thank you for joining us, and have a great day.